September 17, 1941. The clearing outside the village of Krasny Bor. A column of metal moved like a low hill through the mud. The air tasted of diesel and wet earth. In the cab, a young crewman wiped sweat from his brow with a soot-blackened glove and listened to the engine cough and settle. The German lieutenant across the field smiled as his Panzers lined up like hunting dogs. They called the slow, gray vehicle a tractor and laughed. That laughter would not last. The small tank that everyone had dismissed for its ungainly silhouette hid a geometry of survival. Sloped armor, a compact diesel heart, and a gun that, in the right hands, rewrote engagement ranges. What looked awkward would become a machine that outran doctrine, that outpaced ammunition clerk and tactic both. This is the story of how industrial choices, stubborn engineers, and frontline improvisation turned a mocked chassis into a strategic lever, and how a handful of men and women measured the price of that transformation in sweat, metal, and loss. The ridicule began before the first prototype rolled. At a staff briefing, a seasoned commander snorted when the blueprints were unfurled. The sketch showed broad sloped plates and a short stubby turret and an engine tucked low. The officer, steady in a uniform that still smelled of previous campaigns, tapped the drawing with a gloved finger. "You expect this to be a fighter?" he said with a thin smile. Then he laughed and said in a tone meant to end debate, "That is a farm machine, not a weapon." The designers and factory managers did not laugh. Inside a cramped bureau, Viktor Sokolov, the chief engineer, traced the slope of the plate with a forefinger and said quietly, "The angle is our silent weapon. It will bite incoming rounds." The room hummed with a different certainty. The antagonists were not only the men in field gray. They were also the assumptions of the day that prized long barrels and flat plates, and that measured a tank by how well it turned in a duel of traverse and turret speed. The new vehicle, which would be christened by crews and later enemies as something else, failed the eye test, but passed a different engineering logic. Power to weight, internal space for fuel and crew, and a production design that traded finicky precision for repeatable simplicity. The man most associated with the vehicle in the fields was Major Arkady Petrov, an armored officer who had spent the opening months of the conflict riding in older models and keeping notes. He was not an engineer by training, but he read blueprints the way others read letters. Petrov grew up in a railway town where the rhythms of industry were a kind of grammar. At 29, he had been promoted for improvisation on a frozen road where supplies had to cross a river. He remembered engines seized by cold and men who kept pushing. Pistons with chained hands until the machine moved. That memory shaped his way of seeing armor and logistics as inseparable. When his battalion first received the new tanks, he argued with quartermasters and with the factory liaison, who insisted on doctrinal maneuvers. Petrov asked for trials beyond the firing range. He wanted roads, mud, night movement, and the verdict of crews. He would prove that speed on a map is one thing, and speed that allows escape, repositioning, and flank attack is another. Very few trusted his instincts at first. The men who mocked the tank as a tractor called him sentimental. He endured the jokes and kept a small folded list of ideas in the pocket of his field jacket. That list would grow to be a manual in action. Viktor Sokolov, his chief engineer, was different. Sokolov had once been a miner and then a technician at a machine works. He had an entire life of small solutions that fixed breakdowns in the moment. He designed tolerances that allowed parts to be produced quickly and still survive punishment. He insisted on a simple suspension that could chew mud and be repaired at roadside, on a diesel engine that would not catch fire at the first puncture, on an internal layout that allowed a loader to move without tripping over spares. In meetings, he spoke with hands that traced the flow of forces and the line of shots. His backstory was not glamorous. He had known hunger and the smell of uniforms pressed by hand. He had also lost a brother when the summer rains made tracks impassable and an entire convoy stalled on a slope. That loss taught him the value of traction and of leaving room for error. Sokolov believed durability was more than metallurgy. It was a philosophy of margin. On the other side, the German armor commanders embodied a doctrine built around gun length and optics. Oberst Hans Keller of the 12th Panzer Brigade believed speed in long straight lines and accuracy from distance decided battles. Keller had fought in a war where tactics had been refined for flat terrain and for a logistical tale that followed precise schedules. He had been educated in armored schools where a duel between tanks looked like a calculus problem: gun slope, muzzle velocity, range. Keller viewed the new sloped plates with suspicion because they diverged from his expected trajectories. He had a backstory of his own that explained both his confidence and his surprise. Raised on a farm near Kassel, he had been taught to repair tractors and then to push machines beyond tolerances. Combat-hardened, he prized the duels in Italy where a precise shot settled fights. He also carried a memory of one failed crossing where a makeshift bridge took 3 Panzer IVs down with it and cost him several trusted lieutenants. That memory made him conservative about risk and eager to maintain range and formation. The design conversation started in a cold room near the factory. Sokolov and his small team, including Anna Morozova, the production manager, Pavel Denisov, the chief welder, and Olga Petrovna, the drafting technician, argued for a layout that would trade sheer armor thickness for slope and mobility. The prototype rolled out with a Christie-influenced suspension and a compact diesel power plant. Technically, the choices were precise. The engine delivered a calculated specific power that allowed short bursts above 30 km per hour on roads and respectable off-road mobility. The sloping of the frontal plate increased effective thickness at oblique angles by nearly 50% compared to a flat plate of equal mass. The new 76.2 mm gun was shorter than the opponent barrels, but tuned for high explosive rounds and armor pierce at the ranges most likely in Eastern engagements. In a terse technical briefing, Sokolov explained in numbers, "The frontal slope yields an effective value of armor when struck at conventional trajectories that exceeds a horizontal plate of the same mass. The diesel fuel layout reduces fire risk and the suspension increases cross-country acceleration." That explanation was a technical bet against the aesthetic of long barrels and against the training manuals of opponents. It relied on convergences of production and artifice. The ability to fabricate plates in high volume, the welding techniques that would keep seams intact, and a supply chain that prioritized track links, ammunition, and diesel. The early trials were merciless. Training fields turned into pages of trial and error, and training was more casualty than exercise. Crews learned to drive the new machines at night, to feel the weight transfer through the chassis on a slope, to listen for the subtle change in engine tone that warned of impending bearing failure. There were accidents that claimed men and machines. In one practice run outside Luga, the turret ring jammed when debris lodged between mating surfaces, and the crew had to lever the turret by hand while exposed to live fire simulation. The cost of learning was immediate. Petrov sat with mechanics in the mud and argued that acceptable loss in the short term bought survivability later. He would not sugarcoat the trade. Training statistics showed a steep initial attrition rate in the conversion squads as loader errors and clutch failures reduced operational availability. The instructors, like Sergeant Yuri Ivanenko and Captain Mikhail Korovin, pushed the crews until black oil streaks ran on palms and faces. Dialogue in the barracks was blunt. In one exchange that stretched over an hour, the instructor said, "We do not have time for sentiment." The trainee replied, "I cannot stop the clutch from slipping." The instructor said, "Then you will learn to feel it before it fails." The trainee answered, "And if it fails in battle?" The instructor said, "Then you will rely on the neighbor to pull you out. That is not a tactic, but a truth." The trainee said, "I am not afraid of losing a tank.
I am afraid of losing a man. The instructor,
we trained to keep both. There were 5 more exchanges that night about pride, repair, and the ugly calculus of frontline life. Men like Olga and Pavel formed repair crews that could change a track in 25 minutes under shell splatter. Those minutes became survival for many. The first real encounters revealed the tank's signature advantages and exposed doctrine errors. In a patrol near Volchansk, a pair of the new tanks met a group of Panzer IIIs and a single Panzer IV. The German formation, trained to dominate with superior optics and longer gun range, expected to pick off Soviet vehicles before closing. Instead, the engagement turned into a geometry problem that favored slope and numbers. The sloped frontal plates deflected long-shot trajectories more often than the Germans could compute under pressure. The shorter gun, when brought to bear at closer ranges and supported by high explosive ammunition, made the new tanks lethal in urban and broken terrain. A tactical vignette stands out. Petrov's tank engaged first. Over the radio, his loader shouted, "Target at 200 meters." Petrov ordered, "Hold, approach, and then fire at will." The German radio barked a surprise, and one crew called, "Out of range, you must be kidding." Another shouted, "Target lost." The German commander then tried to regain formation and ordered a parallel maneuver. Petrov used a feint and a sudden acceleration through a shallow culvert that changed his angle and exposed the Panzer flank. The duel lasted minutes that stretched like hours. There were 7 direct radio exchanges across both sides, each punctuated by the smell of burned propellant and the metallic taste in the mouths of men who had not eaten. When the firing stopped, 3 German tanks were disabled, and the Soviet pair moved away with 1 damaged suspension. That incident traveled fast as field reports. The phrase, "they called it a tractor," appeared in dispatches with both derision and awe. Those early accounts began to alter opinions in the front and outside it. Field commanders who had mocked the design found their staffs re-examining assumptions. Tactical thinking shifted from head-on confrontation to mobility and partial engagement. Commanders began to use the tanks as shock elements that could refuse a flank, to move quickly between cover, and to pin heavier opponents while infantry closed the distance for close-in work. The boom and zoom equivalent for armor emerged. Short, centered advances that used the tank's short barrel and mobility to strike at critical points and withdraw before the enemy could effectively aim. Quotes from commanders circulated in memos. "Major Petrov's battalion does not seek duel, but it forces enemy choices which we then exploit," read one cable from a front corps commander. That phrase became a kernel of doctrine and invited a new type of training emphasis. Instead of teaching crews that every encounter must be won by gun length, instructors taught them how to orchestrate movement and supporting infantry to compensate for ballistic limitations. At roughly the 30% mark in the narrative, a question lingers that might be the first thing you want to answer aloud. If you had been in the commander's seat when the first Panzers smirked over lines and called the new vehicle a tractor, what would you have done to prove them wrong, to keep your men alive, and to force the enemy to adapt? Their laughter was a tactical resource. It revealed contempt and rigidity. If this account moved you, take a moment and tell us in the comments how you would have chosen to fight. Start your reply with "I would have" or "I think that," and then name one practical change you would have ordered from the field. Your answer helps shape a community conversation about decision-making under pressure. We read every thoughtful comment because those perspectives guide future episodes and allow us to see how technical choices look from different minds. Now back to the field, where patience, production, and improvisation would meet the scale of war. The emblematic encounter that sealed the reputation of the vehicle occurred during a winter offensive where visibility was poor, roads were narrow, and the Germans believed they could channel Soviet movement. The Germans planned an envelopment supported by long-range artillery. The new tank, driven from a cold start by a crew of 3, including driver Nikolai Abramov, loader Elena Sorokina, and commander Petrov, moved through a defile where the German column expected easy targets. Petrov had studied maps and knew the ground was full of hummocks and collapsed culverts. He ordered a movement pattern that used micro-terrain for protection. The enemy expected long lines and engagement at distance. Instead, the approach reduced range and turned the duel inward. The writing of the event is a study in sensory detail. Snow crunched under track as the crews felt a vibration in the chassis. The air smelled of creosote and burned diesel as the first salvo passed overhead. Commander Petrov listened to the radio buzzing and felt each burst through the seat. The tank shuddered as a shell hit the glacis and skidded off. He could taste grit on his teeth from powder in the air. In the compartment, the loader whispered, "They think we are slow." The gunner answered, "They are about to learn otherwise." The driver said, "Keep this track straight." The commander replied, "Keep your head down." The loader added, "Ready to jam rounds." The gunner ended, "Fire." This scene had extended radio exchanges across multiple vehicles, and within the tank, those exchanges stretched into a tense choreography of 7 moves and counter-moves as crew and adjacent units coordinated extraction, reloading, and suppression. The result was a tactical reversal. The German formation, trained to expect static victory by range, found itself unable to maintain coherent fire while under close and sudden attack. The attacked units were survivors of the initial barrage, but poor cohesion cost them. Afterward, many German reports
would use a tone of rueful respect in describing the stubbornness of the new tanks and of the crews who learned to move like wolves around heavier prey. Tension moments multiplied as production ramped and the machines multiplied on the front. One such moment occurred when a supply train was ambushed and a column of tanks found itself low on ammunition at dawn. The men had to choose between withdrawing and creating a bottleneck that would allow German armored units to overrun a flank. The decision had to be made by a young lieutenant, Sergei Lysenko, who had no war experience beyond patrols. He spent the night considering memories of his father's stories about not leaving a wounded man behind. He balanced fear and duty and then ordered his crews to split into small pairs that could scavenge ammunition from knocked-out vehicles while others provided covering fire. That choice drew from training where crews had practiced daring ammunition raids. The scene described smoke, the sting of cold on lips, the metallic scent of spent shells, and human voices hoarse with strain. The raid succeeded, but cost 2 vehicles. The narrative of that decision was recounted later as a moral and tactical crossroad where individual courage reduced a strategic collapse. Another moment of tension took place in a factory when Anna Morozova, the production manager, received word of a direct order to increase output by 30% in 6 weeks. The plant had shortages of rivets and of hardened bearings. Morozova looked at her teams and felt the weight of choices between accelerated schedules and worker safety. She held a meeting where Pavel spoke of overtime and Olga warned of fatigue-induced errors, and Makai, a foreman, suggested a resequencing of weld stations. The debate included 4 exchanges about risk and 3 about morale. In the end, Morozova ordered a staggered shift schedule, reserved a contingency stock of bearings, and initiated on-the-spot training for emergency weld repairs. The immediate period saw a spike in faulty seals, but the contingency protocols cut their long-term attrition. That decision became an industrial tension story that demonstrated the connection between production rate and battlefield endurance. Technical descriptions of the vehicle's systems deserve concise attention. The diesel engine delivered a continuous power output that translated into a power-to-weight ratio, enabling a road speed near 50 kilometers per hour in ideal conditions, but practical cross-country speeds near 25 to 30 kilometers per hour. The sloped armor technique increased effective thickness by angles that often turned medium-caliber kinetic rounds into ricochets. And the Krasny-based suspension offered long travel, which reduced shock loads on tracks and allowed higher burst mobility.
The 76.2mm main armament had a rate of fire dependent on crew training ranging from 6 to 10 rounds per minute in sustained operations. And ammunition logistics prioritized high explosive for infantry support and armor-piercing for anti-tank engagements. As doctrinal changes spread, the
concept of the boom and zoom for armor crystallized into a set of tactics that mixed reconnaissance-informed positioning, mobility exploitation, and short salvo strikes. Leaders like Petrov taught crews to avoid head-on trade-offs where long-barreled opponents excelled and to instead use concealment, flanking, and coordinated infantry suppression. The tactic had a logic: approach under cover to reduce effective enemy range, deliver a pair of high-explosive rounds to silence observation posts, then use a short-tracked sprint to threaten a flank and withdraw before long-range guns could focus. The tactic relied on precise timing and reliable communications. Major Petrov described a maneuver in a field report as a chess gambit with speed instead of pieces. During one notable operation, the tactic was applied in a forested corridor where the enemy had set up a long line of anti-tank guns. A group of 5 tanks approached at dawn on a sunless day and used underbrush and dead trees to reduce target exposure. They struck a supply column, withdrew, then struck again at a different axis. The operation showed that mobility could substitute for sloped firepower and that logistics would struggle to respond when formations were forced to move. Variants followed experience. Engineers introduced a field modification kit that allowed quick re-angling of stowage boxes to act as additional spaced armor, and a reinforced track shoe pattern that reduced slippage on summer clay. A close support variant mounted additional machine guns and a reinforced transmission to handle heavier infantry support loads. Each change required new production jigs and small runs of test parts. One variant included a turret rework that accepted a longer gun for units that expected to engage at higher ranges, while another prioritized internal fuel capacity for extended patrols. Technically, these variants demanded recalibration of weight distribution and reinforcement of suspension elements to maintain mobility. The iterative cycle of battlefield feedback to design, to factory, and back again became a central theme. It was not simply an evolution of a machine, but a dialogue between crews and engineers where the hand of a welder and the call of a commander shaped metal. Industrial scale became the decisive factor. Factories in the Urals, led by managers like Anna Morozova and foremen like Pavel Denisov, reorganized production lines into parallel cells. Manual jigs were replaced by simpler fixtures that allowed unskilled labor to perform critical welds reliably. The rate of production increased as these cells matured. At peak, the combined plants produced thousands of units per month, turning raw steel, track links, and ammunition into a sustained output that the enemy could not mirror economically. The logistics behind that rate were complex. Rail allocations, fuel shipments, and ammunition batching were scheduled in weekly cycles. The supply chain included depots that held buffers of track pads and bearings to avoid stoppages. The production effort also relied on rapid training pipelines where mechanics like Yuri Ivanenko taught standardized repair routines in 48-hour courses. Those courses condensed a lifetime of craft into checklists and practiced motion. The capability to replace a track in under half an hour or to reroute fuel lines in the field multiplied operational availability. Numbers mattered. A front line maintained by 20 tanks could be overwhelmed if the enemy could field 30 and hold numbers longer through logistics. Industrial advantage thus translated directly into strategic choices. The strategic consequences became visible in campaigns. In one southern offensive, the presence of numerous such tanks allowed Soviet commanders to attempt deep flanking moves that cut supply lines and forced German units to redeploy from their centers. At the tactical level, escorts that had previously protected supply convoys had to be rethought when small mobile armor could appear in short order behind lines. Commanders who had relied on static anti-tank arrays found them bypassed or neutralized by coordinated movement. The psychological effect on enemy troops and commanders was measurable. Radios captured after fights contained phrases that admitted surprise and a grudging respect for the tenacity of crews and the numbers that supported them.
Casual notes from German officers included lines like, "We mistook them for tractors who could not fight," and later, "We underestimated the logistic machine behind them." There were costs. The push for production strained resources and morale. Workers like Mikhail Korovin and forewoman Elena Sorokina worked 12-hour shifts. Welding fumes and the taste of hot metal became a daily reality. The human toll of rapid scale was reflected in injuries and in the attrition of craftsmanship as older artisans were replaced by less experienced hands. Yet, the system built redundancy and prioritized parts that could be swapped in the field quickly. That choice reduced the time tanks spent in depots and increased sorties. Moments of tension returned as variants proliferated and German tactics adapted. One such moment came when Oberst Hans Keller personally oversaw a countermaneuver designed to trap fast-moving battalions. Keller set up an ambush using combined arms and minefields. The Soviet commander on the ground, Captain Dmitry Orlov, had to decide whether to commit his battalion to break the encirclement or to conserve forces and risk losing ground. Orlov's memories of earlier ambushes in which hesitation cost entire units shaped his choice. He ordered a feint supported by smoke and then a concentrated push at a weak point. The push relied on speed, a mechanic's quick patch, and the availability of spare track shoes. The engagement lasted hours, and in the aftermath, both sides counted losses and compared costs. That clash demonstrated that adaptation on both sides made tactics more perilous, and that success often rested on the marginal ability to fix and move. A technical procedural note clarifies repair practice. In field repair, the same standardized clip fastener replaced 3 older bolt types, which reduced replacement time by nearly 40% and allowed crews to repair track sections using local forges. The practical effect was to reduce immobilization duration and to keep
vehicles in operational cycles. Another procedural detail concerned ammunition resupply. A convoy batching approach moved rounds in sealed pallets with quick-link couplings so that frontline crews could transfer ammunition under limited fire in less than 20 minutes. Such procedural precisions add up to operational endurance. The human stories remained central. Among the many names that traced through dispatches and letters were Sergeant Yuri Ivanenko, who taught repair drills and later died when a supply column he was organizing was struck. Mechanic Pavel Denisov, who innovated a quick weld that saved dozens of tanks. Forewoman Olga Petrovna, who trained women in riveting and whose laugh was remembered by many. Lieutenant Sergei Lysenko, who chose daring to avert disaster. Foreman Mikhail Korovin, who kept quality under pressure. Anna Morozova, who balanced production and welfare. And Captain Heinrich Braun, a German officer whose later log entry acknowledged a tactical misread. These people gave the machine meaning and were the human axis around which the metal turned. The climax of the story came in a large-scale operation where massed numbers and revised tactics coalesced. It was a campaign that demonstrated how strategy is a sum of design, industry, and human resolve. Field commanders coordinated waves of movement. Engineers on the ground performed patchwork surgery on damaged hulls. Quartermasters rerouted fuel before columns lost momentum, and crews learned to dance between artillery barrages and minefields. The enemy attempted to re-establish dominance through concentrated counterattacks, but found that numbers and a resilient repair pipeline kept the advance going. After weeks, the operation yielded measurable territorial gains and forced an operational pause in the enemy's momentum. The narrative arc that had begun with a mocked chassis now ended with a calculation of resource strain and of choices that had to be made in command rooms. The strategic shift mattered not because a single machine was invincible, but because production, training, and tactical doctrine combined to change options on the map. The epilogue unfolds in 3 temporal beats, each tracking immediate aftermath and longer-term consequences. 1 month after the campaign, front reports indicated that operational availability across participating battalions had improved by nearly a quarter, due to refined repair protocols and to the deployment of standardized spare kits. Crews sent back small notes describing the way they had learned to read engines by sound and to improvise smoke screens from burned fuel drums. In villages near rail hubs, women who had once welded for the first time now supervised small stitches of assembly as part of daytime labor pools. The local economy shifted. Factories reported fewer catastrophic stoppages because of buffer stocks and because foremen implemented shift overlaps that smoothed production peaks. Those small changes translated into more vehicles at the front and into more choices for commanders. 3 months later, the operational picture had altered further. Doctrine papers circulated that formalized the mobility-first approach and assigned value to rapid repair units embedded at the brigade level. German analysis groups reported changes
in enemy tactics and admitted a higher logistical cost to maintain defensive perimeters. Letters home from soldiers contained both fatigue and pride. The men who had learned to handle the machines under fire described in the letters the smell of burning track and the precise motion of a loader in the dark. At the industrial level, centralized procurement changes reduced lead times for bearings and for hardened track components. The supply chain had matured into a loop that both anticipated failures and fed the front line with minimal delay. 6 months on, the strategic landscape showed deeper implications. The presence of the machine in numbers became a lever in planning offensives and forced an opponent to allocate resources to anti-tank defenses that could have been used elsewhere. The enemy's strategic reserves were thinner and more brittle. The most candid of captured German reports conceded that misreading the early machines had cost time and initiative. At home, memorials began to note the names of those who did not return and to celebrate the work of women and men in factories as part of the war effort. The broader reflection was sobering. Technology had not been a silver bullet. It had been a tool that required investment, sacrifice, and adaptation. The victory or loss associated with it was distributed across rail yards, workshops, frontline foxholes, and command tables. In closing, the transformation from mocked tractor to battlefield staple is not a story of a single device alone. It is the narrative of choices, engineering tolerances chosen in dim rooms, the stubbornness of production managers, the improvisations of drivers, and the willingness of commanders to rewrite doctrine. Production numbers are part of the record, and so are human names. By the time the vehicle line reached its peak output, factories were producing thousands of units per month, and maintenance units could turn a disabled tank into a fighting asset in hours, not weeks. Enemy officers who once called it a joke later admitted in reports that they had not accounted for the combination of armor geometry, diesel resilience, and sheer numbers. They wrote lines that were both explanation and confession. If this account resonated, take a moment to reflect on the human dimensions as well. The men and women mentioned here do not exist to make statistics pretty. They were people who learned under pressure, who made sacrifices in workshops and on soil, and who measured victory not in headlines but in extra days of survival for comrades. If you want to see more of these connective stories between design, industry, and battlefield decision-making, subscribe and leave a comment telling us which element struck you most. Was it the engineering trade-off, the industrial scaling, or the frontline improvisation? Start your reply with "I would have" or "I think that" to help frame the discussion. We read your thoughts, and they shape future investigations into how machines and people together changed history. We laughed at the machine in that first morning. Outside Krasny Bor, the laughter was born of expectation and the comfort of doctrine. Months later, the same battlefield maps showed that laughter to be a misplaced currency. The final calculus combined numbers and names. Production rates and an evolving logistics pipeline meant more sorties. Tactical shifts and improved repair procedures increased operational availability. Enemy reports that began with derision ended with lines conceding the tactical error of judging by silhouette alone. In the end, the machine did not win wars by itself. It amplified choices. It turned a doctrine that prized duels at long distance into a reality where mobility, numbers, and repair cycles counted more. The people who made, maintained, and fought these vehicles left traces in letters and in metal that historians and engineers still consult.
They remind us that technology becomes strategic when it is married to industry and to the stubborn adaptability of people in impossible conditions. Remember to subscribe if you want more episodes that trace how industrial choices meet battlefield outcomes and leave a legacy in both steel and memory. And tell us in the comments how you would have decided if you had Arkady Petrov's folded list of ideas in your pocket. Start your line with "I would have" and help us build the next conversation. About a generation later, someone would write that they had once mocked a tractor and been forced to learn the mathematics of loss and effort. The lesson is simple and harsh. Machines do not make war vanish. They change its shape, and the cost is counted in the people who press buttons and keep watch in the cold light of dawn.